Godwyn the Golden is a character who casts a long shadow over Elden Ring's story, despite not being a particularly active player in the current era. Now known as the Prince of Death, Godwyn's soul murder during the Night of the Black Knives is arguably the event that kickstarts the Shattering. Additionally, his death would also result in the spread of the Deathroot, and the rise of those who live in death. Shadow of the Erdtree did not focus on Godwyn, and yet it did still provide us with some new insights into the Prince of Death and his followers. Additionally, the DLC gave us far more regarding death in general, and how it works in the world of Elden Ring. Spirits and the mechanisms that manage death in the current era have always been a bit of a mystery, yet the DLC revealed to us the concept of gold and shadow and the Scadutree, the Erdtree's shadow that manages all things shadow, including death. New questions and answers arise from this new lore. We learn more about Godwyn, where he fits in the timeline and who his followers were. But why is Godwyn's cadaver here, in a place that is physically disconnected from the lands between? And why are Godwyn's loyal followers looking for these cadaver surrogates? Death has always been a unique mechanism in the lands between, and so in this lore video, we will be exploring the lore of Godwyn and death as it is explained in Shadow of the Erdtree. But before we get started, remember that if you like Elden Ring lore, then consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more. But before we dive into the lore of Godwyn, it is time for a word from today's sponsor, Factor, who are once again partnering with Smowtown to feed the lore. Factor is the perfect option for Tarnished, who are strapped for time, offering a stress-free and healthy alternative to take-out meals. Each meal is ready within 2 minutes, chef-made and is dietitian approved. With over 35 meal choices per week, you will never be strapped for choice, and no matter your dietary requirements, Factor has you covered, offering keto, calorie smart and vegetarian options. The best thing about Factor is that it allows you to escape the takeout trap, whilst being faster, healthier, but with the same convenience, meaning you don't need to tidy, prep or cook. For those wanting to give Factor a try, they are offering Smowtown viewers a great deal. Get 50% off and free shipping on your first Factor box using my link. Click the link in the description or scan the QR code with your phone. Thanks again to Factor for sponsoring this video, and now back to the lore. I am sure I'm not alone in trying to imagine what Godwyn would have been like in his prime, as we hear a lot about him. An influential leader who played an important role in the war with the ancient dragons. Additionally, we do see some of Godwyn in the opening cinematic to the game, and he is exactly what we would expect of Marika's brood. Heroic, strong, and blonde. I have always assumed that Godwyn is of the Golden lineage, and directly born of Marika and Godfrey, and there are obvious reasons for believing so. First off, the events that he is involved with suggest he is one of the earlier children of Marika, such as the War of the Ancient Dragons, which seems to be a bit earlier in Leyndell's history. Additionally, I know the name convention theory is imperfect, but I do think his name does suggest he is of Godfrey's line. Of course, we can't ignore that he is called Godwyn the Golden, a moniker that Godric will also later take, who is himself of the Golden lineage. We get Godwyn's placement as an early child of Marika confirmed in the DLC thanks to the Crimson Amber Medallion +3, which reads as follows. The Erdtree's old sap becomes amber, treasured as the most precious of jewels in the age of Godfrey, the first Elden Lord. These medallions, of the largest variety, were conferred to Godwyn's inner circle of distinguished Golden Knights. I like the consistency here, as we already knew from the base game that these types of amber medallions were indeed treasures of the age of Godfrey. The base game amber medallions heavily suggest that Godfrey oversaw the so-called Age of Plenty, the age when the bounty of the Erdtree fell freely from its boughs in the form of dew. The amber is clearly some of that dried dew that contains the life-giving qualities of the Erdtree, hence they boost our vitality and various attributes. The DLC takes this element of the lore and ropes in Godwyn and his knights, and so we now know that Godwyn and his followers were very much active during this Age of Plenty, and under Godfrey's rule, likely confirming he is indeed the son of Godfrey. When it comes to what we know about Godwyn as a person, we know that he is someone who clearly inspires loyalty and respect. Fortisax, once an enemy of Godwyn, becomes so loyal to him that he goes to extreme lengths to cure his friend of the death within him, going so far as to enter the mind of Godwyn himself, where he would battle and be overcome by death. Fortisax is not the only one who mourns Godwyn's death. It is heavily implied that Godwyn's death causes Marika such grief that it eventually pushes her to trigger the shattering, or at the very least it is the straw that breaks the camel's back. We also find a finger reader, mourning the Prince of Death's fate in the Great Root Depths.
Oh, Lord Godwyn, such cruelty, such humiliation. Oh, my poor sweet lordling should have died a true death.
Godwyn's loss was a massive blow to the Golden Order, and in many ways it marked the end and decline of its rule. As the Prince of Death, Godwyn also inspires loyalty, with the likes of Fia who jumps through many hoops in order to bring about Godwyn's Age of the Duskborn. Of course, we cannot forget that Godwyn earns the admiration of Mikla himself, who not only honours Godwyn in death, but also seemingly collaborates with the people of Castle Sol, in an attempt to help restore Godwyn's soul via the eclipse. This has always been the impression of Godwyn that I had, one of the best of the royal family, a warrior strong enough to defeat the ancient dragons, yet magnanimous in befriending them afterwards. A man who even aesthetically fits a classical ideal of a godly hero, thus it is all the more tragic when it is this noble soul who is killed during Ranni's ritual. The tragedy is heightened when we see the warped remains of Godwyn, eliciting a similar revulsion in me that true King Allant did when I first played Demon's Souls in 2011. This untarnished image of Godwyn is only reinforced in the DLC, where we meet more followers of his who are equally loyal. The Death Knights are clearly those who were once the Golden Knights of Godwyn, as described by the medallion we just looked at, his personal guard, and thus likely his most loyal followers and most skilled warriors. Now they have been much transformed, following their lord even into death. Their armour set reads the following: Golden Armour of the Death Knights, adorned with an antiquated depiction of the Erdtree. These knights, once Godwyn's personal guard, quested to find their transfigured master's cadaver surrogate for the coming age of the Duskborn. These knights are so loyal that they have transformed from the Golden Knights to the Death Knights, serving their master no matter what form he takes. The strength of their allegiance is also illustrated by their helmets, with the golden ring symbolising their eternal loyalty to their lord. Zeph the Scholar makes a good observation in his excellent lore video on Godwyn, which will be linked below. In this, Zeph relates the shape of these helms to that of Wound of the Centipede, and I do find this quite compelling. I would speculate then that these were affixed to their helmets following Godwyn's death, and it represented their conviction to follow their master into death. The length of their service likely dates all the way back to the war with the ancient dragons, and Godwyn's actions that led to the founding of the ancient dragon cult. I say this because the Death Knights are able to use ancient dragon cult incantations, including Knight's Lightning Spear. This incantation's description tells us it was an incantation taught only to the most accomplished knights, and now it is a lost art in the lands between. This tells us that the Death Knights were likely some of the oldest and most accomplished Dragon Knights, which is to be expected given they are Godwyn's close companions, and Godwyn was personally involved in the founding of the ancient dragon cult. I would love to have seen these knights in their prime, decked out in golden armour, embracing the ancient dragons as their liege once did. One detail I like here is that these helms are described as their death masks. In real life, death masks are impressions taken of a person's face upon their death, so their visage may be preserved, meaning these knights followed their master into death, in the most literal sense possible. This is very similar to the mausoleum knights that guard the soulless demigods, who also joined their liege lords in death. But more on the mausoleums and soulless demigods soon. These knights have come all the way to the lands of shadow, in the service of their lord, in order to secure and guard his cadaver surrogates. The purpose behind securing these additional vessels is tantalizing, but before we dive into it, we need to once again discuss the lands of shadow and its relation to death. I am going to be discussing a lot of concepts in this chapter, and so to make things as clear as possible, I want to present my current thoughts on the lands of shadow. I have changed my thoughts on all this, so forgive me for once again going over it. I believe that in the time of the Hornsent, the lands of shadow overlaid the same space as the lands between. I believe that when Marika became a god, she created the Golden Order, by separating out various elements from the Elden Ring, including death. This is why the story trailer tells us that at this moment, both gold and shadow were created. The elements that were removed would become represented by the Erdtree's shadow, the Scadutree. The Scadutree has existed as long as the Erdtree has, and I believe that the lands of shadow were also immediately disconnected from the lands between at this moment. I do not believe the Scadutree ever occupied the same space as the Erdtree. Thematically, it is its shadow, and thus I believe this always has existed in a shadow realm. As above, so below. It became a well for death at this stage, with all of death being pulled from the lands between into the lands of shadow. I do not believe that the separation of the lands of shadow and the sealing of the lands of shadow are the same thing. I believe that Marika and her regime had a relationship with the lands of shadow, despite its spatial displacement, and death was managed and transported to this underworld. It was part of her domain, and she allowed it to exist and continue to operate as the underworld. Later, however, Marika decided to bury the lands of shadow. She specifically wanted it to become a container for everything that could threaten her rule. Specifically, I believe that as the Age of Plenty waned and her power weakened, she wanted to bury the truth about godhood. The truth that she was not truly divine, she is not the one true god, nor was she the first. I think she wanted to hide the gate of divinity, and the truth of her ascension, and so she whipped up hate against the Hornsent, and called for a crusade. Messmer led this, but he too was tricked, for she wanted rid of the darkness within him as well. And so, as the dutiful son went about his mission, the lands of shadow were veiled. In short, I believe that the lands of shadow have been separate from the moment of Marika's ascension, but that they were not sealed and hidden until Messmer's crusade entered. In time, the Scadutree would be forgotten, along with Marika's origins. I think that after this sealing, only the dead could still be drawn to the lands of shadow, like the Death Knights and Godwyn's surrogates. The land would be forgotten, but some elements of death would still slip through the veil from time to time. There are a few reasons I believe this to be the case. The first is just that it makes more thematic sense. The Scadutree is seen as the shadow of the Erdtree, and I therefore think from a cosmological standpoint, this tree would exist in a mirror or shadow dimension to the Erdtree. There is also a really important piece of lore that discusses this particular element of the lore, and that's the description of the Shadow Militia armor. It reads the following: freshly singed battlegrounds effusing with the stench of the dead, forbidden lands that will be excised from the memory of history. What better place than the realms of shadow then, for such an army? This shows an intent to hide and seal the lands of shadow at a time in which they were already known as the realms of shadow. The term realm is not one you would use to describe a land that lies right next to your capital. It is a more suitable term for a completely separate dimension. Additionally, they are also referred to here as forbidden, suggesting that these lands were known but forbidden from the lands between denizens before they were sealed. Both of these facts seem to exist before Marika fully sealed them and had their history erased, and to me it supports the idea that the Lands of Shadow had long been separate and forbidden, but they were not fully sealed and hidden until after Messmer's crusade. As an aside, these Shadow Militia cannot use bestial incantations, nor destined death flames like the base game militia can. This suggests that the sealing of these lands took place before the Night of the Black Knives, and I do believe this lines up with the timeline I have previously suggested, after Radagon's marriage to Ranala, but before the Shattering, likely in the period after the Age of Plenty, when Marika's rule will have become more tenuous. With that said, let us dive into the details of the Scadutree, as I find it fascinating that it became a vessel for everything that was removed from the Golden Order. This is more or less outright confirmed by the description of the Scadutree Avatar's remembrance, which reads the following. The Scadutree is the shadow of the Erdtree, born of dark notions that bear no sense of order, that twist and bend its stalk, rendering it brittle. To me, this is one of the most important item descriptions in the whole of the DLC, as it concisely explains what these lands are and what their role is in Elden Ring's cosmology. The Erdtree represents life, light, and order, and thus the Scadutree is born of death, darkness, and disorder. The Scadutree was once venerated as part of the Erdtree pantheon, before Marika buried the past. Indeed, Scadutree fragments were once seen as holy objects by the people of the Erdtree, and were used in their prayers. However, by the time the game takes place, people have forgotten about the Erdtree's other half. Perhaps they were displaced, but very much accessible by those granted access by Marika. There was definitely intent to have these lands sealed though, and we see this in Messmer's remembrance. But another interesting piece of lore regarding this actually comes from the Shadow Militia set, which we read previously. So this tells us that there was an intent to excise these lands from memory and history. This was obviously effective as prior to the DLC, we ourselves had absolutely no idea that the Lands of Shadow existed. The original Golden Order was one of gold and shadow, and yet now most don't even know the Scadutree exists. If they did, they would realise that death does have a place within this order of duality. As a result, the Golden Order's ideas surrounding death have been warped by the loss of this knowledge.
I serve the Golden Order, that I might put this crooked land to rights, following only the guidance of the great Elden Ring. Those who live in death fall outside the principles of the Golden Order. Their mere existence sullies the guidance of gold, tainting its truth. And so it is the vermin must be exterminated, down to the very last.
So to surmise, I now believe that the Lands of Shadow were always disconnected from the lands between, but this was a known fact and there was a connection between the two, and the Lands of Shadow were openly the realm of the dead. It was only later that Marika severed this connection and buried the secrets found in the Lands of Shadow. But these lands were not originally lands of death. Prior to Marika, they would have existed in the physical world, and they were the lands of the Hornsent and the Crucible. We have to imagine that prior to Marika's actions there would have been no spirit graves, no grave birds, and no coffin barges. These lands will have seen a remarkable transformation under Marika's reign as it adapted to its new role as the underworld. We know from various item descriptions that after this cosmological shift, all forms of death would drift here, be that deathrite birds or undead dragons. One of the most interesting examples is that of the spirit graves, mainly found in gravesite plains, and I believe that these too were pulled here. The spirit gravestone item description reads the following. In places where the dead have been brought since antiquity, the oldest gravestones turn into spirits and then fade away. To me, this implies that these are graves from all over the world, from different civilizations and periods, and that over time they become spirits, and are drawn to the lands between with every other element of death. The gravebirds are also interesting to me, because while we find deathrite birds in the lands between, the gravebirds are something unique to the Lands of Shadow. I had assumed these were creations of the Horn Scent, and that they likely partook in the death rites, given these funerary practices were dominant in the age before the Erdtree, and there is a good chance that this is still the case. However, as I have just said, these lands will have become more associated with death after the birth of the Scadutree, and thus is it also not possible that these were created following Marika's ascension. I do now believe this, and my main source for this is the description of the Gravebird armor set. Initially, the use of the word ancient here had thrown me off, because I often associate this word with the eras prior to Marika's rule. But bear in mind, even the Shattering is thought to be thousands of years ago, and the early age of Marika's rule is known as the Ancient Erdtree era. Additionally, this armor set specifically relates their creation to the spirit graves, which they are meant to guard. Before, I had over-focused on their relationship to the Deathrite birds. However, their role in guarding the spirit graves is an important factor to consider in trying to date the creation of the grave birds. Given all we have discussed, I think it is unlikely that the spirit graves were here before the Scadutree, and thus these grave birds must have been created during Marika's rule. I certainly have been guilty of ignoring the relevance of death to the Golden Order. Just because the Rune of Death was removed from the Golden Order doesn't mean that accommodations were not made for the dead and spirits. The catacombs were constructed in order to facilitate Erdtree burial, and were important enough to warrant their own golems, the Erdtree burial watchdogs. We learn from their staff item description that these beings oversee the imps, meaning they too were put in place to safeguard these catacombs. What is interesting is that these beings are clearly products of sorcery, given their weapons are embedded with glintstone, and they are able to use magic. My speculation is that these represent a joint collaboration between Liurnia and the Erdtree Order, the former providing the sorceries necessary to animate them. I assume that the grave birds must have been made through similar processes, as they definitely share some aesthetic similarities to the imps and watchdogs. Additionally, if they were built after the arrival of the spirit graves, but were also meant to be companions to the death birds, then the Golden Order were well aware that the death rites would be drawn into this realm, and they actively made accommodations for them, in the form of these bird golems. Additionally, we need to consider the wording of the epitaph found atop the Pillar of Suppression, which tells us that death is drawn here, and then suppressed. Given the name of this tower, I presume it has some role in that suppression. Again, it suggests to me that this is a construction of the Golden Order, to ensure that the realms of Shadow contain death and suppress it. The lands of Shadow were a part of the Golden Order's management of death. I think the catacombs and watchdogs alone show how much consideration the Golden Order gave towards death and its management. However, it was the lands of Shadow that would contain the majority of death for the Golden Order. Therefore, the early Erdtree Order made sure that the new lands of death were fit to receive all the dead that would be flowing from the lands between. However, this system was new. Prior to Marika, the lands of the living and the dead were not separated by a veil, or disconnected spatially, and thus it makes sense that the dead would need guiding from one land to another. They required guidance, and that is why there are lots of mechanisms in place to help guide the dead along their intended path, as never before did they need to pass via a veil. One great example of this is the lore surrounding the Helfin, which is described to us in the item description of Helfin's Steeple. This item reads the following: Great sword patterned after the black steeple of the Helfin, the lampwood which guides the dead of the spirit world. The lamplight is similar to grace in appearance, only it is said that it can only be seen by those who met their death in battle. Spirits in general have been something that have long confused us in Elden Ring. We get inexplicable examples of various spirits wandering the world. Even spirit trees are found in the mountaintops of the giants. I think we can now understand these phenomena. Earlier I read the item description of the spirit gravestone, which tells us that the oldest graves would fade and become spirits. Perhaps that is the case with these spirit trees as well. the oldest trees fading from the physical world and remaining as spirits. I therefore believe that spirits would have been guided to the lands of shadow via the Helfin's light, much like the dead can follow Rose's light to the catacombs. But what is the Helfin? It is described as a lampwood in the English, but a Reddit post by user Aki provides an insight into the original Japanese. Aki provides the translation of lampwood as lantern tree, making it clear that it is a tree that is acting as a beacon. I think following the DLC, we have to conclude that the Helfin is another name for the Scadutree, and that at one point it would help guide the spirits between worlds. A black tree that exists in the spirit realm and draws the dead to it. Additionally, I find the choice of relating its light to grace very purposeful. Would it not make sense that at one stage the Scadutree had its own form of the guidance of grace but for the dead? Perhaps this guidance was lost, or prevented from reaching the lands between, following Marika's decision to seal the lands of shadow, and this is why we can still find spirits stranded in the lands between. This is an oft-repeated idea in Elden Ring, that various guides exist in this world to guide the spirits of the dead, because they need such guidance. The specific term for these types of guides is psychopomps, and they exist in many cultures and religions throughout history. One of the most famous is of course Charon, the boatman of Greek mythology that takes the dead across the river Styx into the underworld. Charon is clearly the inspiration behind the Tibia Mariners, and I will put forth the theory in the next chapter that the Mariners do indeed ride an etheric tide of death between the two realms, in order to guide the dead to the lands of shadow. However, there is another psychopomp who has very little lore about him, and that is Rosus. But I do want to discuss what little we do know about him, as his statues are also found in the lands of shadow. We learn from Rosus's axe that he is the figure depicted on the statues that guide us to the catacombs, and that the blue light that emanates from these statues is meant to guide the dead to their final resting place. Does this mean that the catacombs in the lands of shadow, which have roots in them and Rosus outside, disprove my theory that the lands of shadow were disconnected at the beginning of Marika's rule? If I am right, then how do I explain the presence of roots and Rosus here, signs that point to these catacombs once being used for Erdtree burial? Well, no, because I believe these are the roots of the Scadutree, not the Erdtree, and my main reason for believing so is the existence of the not resin item. This description states that this is a resin specifically found round the roots of trees in the lands of shadow exclusively. Indeed, we can find some of this resin within the Fog Rift catacombs, the location of one of the cadavers. The knot shape, of course, heavily implies that the roots of the Scadutree are the main source of this substance, and that they are likely running underneath the ground in the lands of shadow. Additionally, it is just a case of Occam's razor. Their Scadutree dominates this region, so naturally the roots of this massive tree would stretch deep into the earth of this area. Following the death of Godwyn, I then believe that his surrogates would be pulled from the lands between and into the lands of shadow, where they so happen to break into these pre-existing catacombs. I also don't believe this necessarily suggests there was such a thing as Scadutree burial, though that is an interesting concept. I think that some of the catacombs were later repurposed for Erdtree burials, and that they were previously used as more traditional burial sites. However, as pointed out by Zafe in his Godwyn Lore video, you can indeed see humans being absorbed by the Scadutree. I do believe that despite being spatially disconnected, that the Scadutree and the Erdtree are ultimately connected, and thus Scadutree burial would work just as well as Erdtree burial. To surmise this chapter, I believe that the lands of shadow became the Well of Death at the moment Marika created the Golden Order and became a god. I believe that the Golden Order understood and respected the underworld status of the lands of shadow, and various tools were created in order to manage death, like the Gravebirds. The lands between would become a deathless realm because of Marika's decision to separate the Rune of Death and separate the lands between and the lands of shadow. With that said, I now want to discuss an element of this dual system that I have been dancing around, and that is how death is pulled from the lands between and the lands of shadow. One subject I didn't ever really cover in any of my prior videos was the wandering mausoleums and the soulless demigods within. Given their undeniable connection to Godwyn, I do think it is appropriate we deal with it now. A really great video by Ratatosker on this subject really re-energized my interest in this subject recently. So I do just want to credit the squirrel right now, because while I will directly reference him at points, please know that his video has more broadly influenced my opinions on this subject. As Ratatosker points out, some of the most interesting information regarding these mausoleums come from three main sources: the Eclipse Crest Heater Shield, the Eclipse Crest Great Shield, and the ghost found near the Weeping Coast Mausoleum. Let's start with the dialogue from the ghost, who says the following: "The mausoleum prowls, cradling the soulless demigod. O Marika, Queen Eternal, he is your unwanted child." So here we get it confirmed that these mausoleums contain more of Marika's demigod children, who, like Godwyn, are soulless. The main explanation for this is that these gods also had the souls killed during the Night of the Black Knaves. Indeed, this does seem to reflect a lore article that was published on the Bandai Namco website back in 2021, alongside the story trailer for the base game. The article says the following of the Night of the Black Knives: "One grim night in the depths of winter, a flock of unknown assassins stole across the lands between. In a coetaneous attack, this foul covenant snuffed out the lives of many of the God Queen's kin throughout the Empire, too numerous and too scattered for her godly protection to save. The assassins' targets were multifold, but none was as devastating a loss to the Eternal Queen as that of Godwyn the Golden. After his death, the Elden Ring was somehow shattered, and the order of the world broke with it. So this tells us that the attack killed many of Marika's kin, specifically that they were numerous and multifold. Our conclusion must be that more than Godwyn died that night, he was the first of the demigods to fall, but not the last. We know that Godwyn was killed in a specific manner, so that the effects of the Rune of Death could be split between himself and Ranni, with Ranni only dying in body in order to advance her designs. Ranni died in body at the exact moment that Godwyn died in soul. They both had half of the wound of the centipede carved into their backs at the same time, thus splitting the rune's effect between them. I have always believed that this was the true aim of the Night of the Black Knives, at least from the perspective of Ranni. If these other demigods are soulless as well, it means that they suffered soul death in the same way that Godwyn did. I have long maintained that Ranni hid her true intentions from her co-conspirators. She marketed it as a lethal blow against the Golden Order, and yet she was mainly doing it to complete her ritual and slay her Empyrean flesh. I speculate that after the Night of the Black Knives, she hung the assassins out to dry, allowing them to be hounded and hunted by the Golden Order without protecting them. I even speculate that she imprisoned Alecto, the assassin leader, as she can be found in an Ever jail in Moonlight Altar. I believe this can also explain why the other demigods killed this night were also killed in soul only. Ranni needed Godwyn to die a soul death for her purposes, but she wouldn't want to share the true reason why. She wouldn't want to draw attention to Godwyn's murder by specifying a different way of killing. Therefore, I believe she told the assassins to kill them all in the manner Godwyn was killed, in soul only. There is, of course, the possibility that these demigods caught Deathroot after Godwyn began to spread it. However, given these are specifically demigods, I think it is most likely that they too were victims of the Black Knife assassins, those described in the Bandai Namco article. The Mausoleum Knights and Soldiers are very interesting to me, as they clearly share the same model as the soldiers and knights of the other demigods. To me, it suggests that they once did serve a demigod who was once alive and had armies much like Godric, etc. The description of the Mausoleum Knight set supports this theory, as it reads the following: The wing-shaped ornaments on its back evoke the Deathbird, a self-inflicted curse that ties the spirits of these loyal knights to the land, having willingly beheaded themselves so that they may serve their masters in death. I believe that each contingent of mausoleum soldiers are specifically aligned with the demigod in their nearby mausoleum, rather than them generally being servants of the mausoleums. They were once soldiers that served in the armies of these soulless demigods, who underwent a beheading ritual that allowed them to serve their lords in death. The headless element is interesting, especially when we consider that the bodies of the soulless demigods also lack a head. So what is going on here? Well, there are actually 2 ritual axes associated with death, and while we don't get any specifics, I assume that the axe associated with the Deathbird was likely used here, given Deathbird iconography that the Mausoleum Knights bear upon their back. Additionally, the sacrificial axe alludes to an ancient rite being tied to this axe, putting 2 and 2 together. It is likely this rite is the same one used by the Mausoleum Knights. Both the description of the sacrificial axe and the Mausoleum Knight armor speak of some ancient ritual. Both also mention the Deathbirds. And of course, what tool would you use for a rite that involves beheading? An axe. As I have pointed out in numerous videos, the death rites of these birds are ancient, predating the very existence of the Erdtree. As such, it is likely a very old rite here that is being employed to allow these soldiers to persist as spirit warriors. It was only under Marika's rule that the Rune of Death was removed from the Elden Ring and confined to the Scadutree. In the times before the Erdtree, we can imagine that the Rune of Death would have been utilised more freely and in more unique ways. I would therefore suggest that this beheading ritual utilises half of the Rune of Death in order to kill these warriors in body only, much like Ranni was, and as a result they are able to persist in soul after death. This is of course speculation, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this beheading ritual in the comments below. What about the soulless demigod? Why are they beheaded? Why are they in this mausoleum to begin with? Why does it need to walk? Well, the reason for the mausoleums are seemingly revealed in the description of the Eclipse Crest's great shield, which reads the following. The eclipsed sun, drained of colour, is the protective star of soulless demigods. It aids the Mausoleum Knights by keeping destined death at bay. So the purpose of these mausoleums seems to be to keep destined death at bay. And we have another location related to the eclipse, Castle Sol. This location is about returning the soul to Godwyn, who presumed to be Mikla's comrade, that is mentioned in the dialogue of a ghost found here, who says the following. Lord Mikla, forgive me. The sun has not been swallowed. Our prayers were lacking. Your comrade remains soulless. So we have 2 locations connected to the eclipse and the soulless demigods, and we know their aims are twofold. To keep destined death at bay, and to return their souls. I would therefore suggest that decapitation must also play a role in this. Perhaps the removal of their head delays the approach of destined death. Beheading is often ritualistic, and so it was in the case of their soldiers who were beheaded prior to death, and in some way this preserves them from full death. To me, these mausoleums are meant to protect the soulless demigods, to prevent destined death from fully claiming them, to give them time to return their soul to them. They are meant to preserve them from full death. Why are they on legs? Well, this is where we get into speculation, but having looked more closely at the visual details of the mausoleum, I do have some ideas. You will of course know that at the base of these golems are legs that seem to be covered in skulls, and it took me a long time to realise what these are supposed to be. They are meant to be barnacles of death. Now I find this to be very interesting because there is a lot of water imagery associated with death in Elden Ring's lore, and this is something I discussed extensively in my prior Godwyn video, and I would direct you there for a more in-depth explanation. But in short, I believe the reason water is so commonly associated with death in Elden Ring is due to a symbolic combination of the Greek myth of the river Styx and the Japanese ideas of stagnation and corruption, or kagari, the latter of which is often represented by stagnant water, like that we see pooling around Godwyn in deep root depths. It has always fascinated me that the Tibia mariners seem to be floating on an unseen river, and I believe that death is somehow connected to some etheric river, a swirling channel of death that is unseen by the naked eye, and I believe this force sweeps death to the lands of shadow. We now know that all things death eventually end up in the lands of shadow. For example, the Gravebird helm reads the following: Gravebirds are ancient golems, created to guard the spirit graves built where all manners of death ultimately drift. So dead things drift here, be that spirits or undead dragons. Some metaphysical force pulls death from the lands between to the lands of shadow. In the prior chapter we explained the relation the lands of shadow have to death, that it is a land completely separated from the lands between, and it sucks all death from the former. I believe that it is a metaphysical river-like force that pulls death through the veil into the lands of shadow. So returning to the mausoleums and how they help illustrate this theory, I believe that these are designed to keep the demigods out of death's reach, in order to prevent them from being swept from the lands between to the lands of shadow. This is why the mausoleums are kept high up on walking legs. This hypothetical etheric river is constantly running beneath the mausoleums, thus leaving barnacles of death on its legs, whilst keeping the demigod out of reach. In the DLC we do have 3 more soulless demigods, which function the exact same way, except they are on the ground and without a mausoleum. I believe divesting these 3 of mausoleums was a purposeful lore choice, as these are demigods who have been pulled into the realm of the Scadutree. A walking mausoleum would have no role here in the lands of shadow. I want to go back to the description of the Gravebird helm, which tells us that all death drifts to the lands of shadow. Drift is a word that we could associate with tidal movements, considering driftwood is a term given to wood that is washed up on shores. However, there is a more direct allusion to death and water in relation to the lands of shadow, and we find this in the epitaph found atop the Pillar of Suppression. It reads the following: the very centre of the lands between. All manners of death wash up here, only to be suppressed. Death washes up here. The relation to water could not be more direct, and I therefore think it is very fair to conclude that an etheric stream of some kind, understood only by the Tibia mariner, drags death from the lands between to the lands of shadow. I would suggest that the Tibia mariners do indeed take on a similar role to Charon, guiding the dead along this stream, making sure it arrives correctly on the shores of the lands of shadow. Indeed, it is hard to ignore the fact we have a location in the lands of shadow called Ker-O's Hidden Grave, which is an obvious reference to Charon, and is an area very heavily associated with death, given it hosts a deathrite bird, gravebirds, and a Tibia mariner. The lands of shadow have other forms of death arriving on its shores, including the stone coffins, which are also described as having drifted here. The map of the southern shore reads the following: a captivating vista of brilliant blue flowers, intermingled with colossal stone coffins of unknown origin that seemingly drifted to this place. So the coffins are not native to this place, they have drifted here. They contain death in the form of the putrescence, and so it isn't surprising that they too have been pulled here via the etheric tide we have been discussing. All of this is to explain how Godwyn's copies can be found here. As I mentioned earlier, there is some debate on when the lands of shadow were separated from the lands between, either at the moment of Marika's ascension when she created the system of gold and shadow, or when she sealed Mesmer and his crusade here. I myself have argued the latter in prior videos, citing the presence of Devonia and Godwyn as proof that the lands of shadow must have still been attached to the lands between, as how else would they both have been able to travel here? Well, having discussed what I have regarding this theoretical etheric tide, I now don't think we can use Godwyn as an argument, as clearly his copy bodies could have been drawn here, given how suffused in death he is. Likewise, his Death Knights are indeed dead. They are wearing their own funerary masks as helms after all, so they too would be able to travel here in the same manner. That is to say, I believe that all things death would be able to metaphysically travel to these lands, despite the physical displacement of the Lands of Shadow. With that all said, let us now move on to the discussion of Godwyn's copy bodies, and what role they play in the greater story. Again, I have discussed the phenomenon of the Godwyn's copies in my prior video, and to surmise I largely agree with Zuli's analysis of these unusual artifacts. In a video called The Terrible Truth About Godwyn, Zuli argues that the additional faces of Godwyn are likely just growths, or extensions. Zuli points out that we can even see Godwyn's eyes through the spread of Deathroot, as if he himself is part of this growth. Additionally, Zaif the Scholar, in his video about Godwyn's corruption, points out that some of the roots actually have fish-like appendages, much like we find on Godwyn himself, and my conclusion is that Godwyn is infused through Deathroot itself. And so when it spreads, not only does it spread undeath, but it also spreads Godwyn himself. Hence why we can see his eyes on roots, and infected animals like the giant crabs of Liurnia. Godwyn is now an infectious growth that is spreading through the lands between. Thus the Godwyn below Storm Vale is just a more advanced form of Deathroot growth, in my opinion. The armour set of the Death Knights gives the growths found in the Lands of Shadow a specific title, a surrogate cadaver. Additionally, we learn from the Death Knight twin axes that these loyal followers sought these out and now guard them. I think it is clear that these catacombs were not built around Godwyn's cadaver, due to the broken Rosa statues found outside. These were regular catacombs like any other, but they have been taken over by the Death Prince's followers, as it contains Death Knights and these Death Sorcerers who cast Death Sorceries. Additionally, we have to consider the new basilisk statues found in these catacombs, deadly Godwyn-themed traps that are clearly intended to protect these surrogate cadavers. But what is so important about these surrogates? Why has so much effort been expended by the followers of Godwyn to protect these additional growths? Well, I do think there is a slight difference in these surrogates and the copy found at Stormvale Castle, and I believe that difference is they are physically disconnected from the original Godwyn. These cadavers have made their way to the Lands of Shadow, and thus are spatially displaced, unlike the one at Stormvale that is likely still connected to the original Godwyn. Thus, these cadavers in the Lands of Shadow are a completely untouched vessel that could be used for Godwyn's resurrection. Zaif does raise an interesting question about these Godwyn surrogates in his video that can play into everything I have been saying. In his video, he questions how these Godwyn surrogates could be growths, if there is no Deathroot growth surrounding them. He is correct, as in most places associated with Godwyn we see the undeniable corruption of Deathroot, yet in these DLC catacombs there is nothing, no sign of Deathroot corruption. My answer to this question is the main thesis of this video. These Godwyn surrogates did not grow here, they were pulled here, and through this process, they became separated from the original Godwyn. This is why these cadaver surrogates are special and valued by the Death Knights. They are distinct separate vessels that could be used as a replacement body for Godwyn. I think it is almost undeniable that the intent behind these additional surrogates is meant to tie to the gate of divinity and the resurrection of a lord. The language used regarding a surrogate cadaver, to me, is very similar to Mohg's body being used as a vessel for Radahn's return. Mohg's body is a cadaver surrogate for Radahn's soul. We also cannot ignore the reference to the age of the Duskborn, the ending we get if we incorporate the rune of the Death Prince into the Elden Ring. Make no mistake, this ending is Godwyn's ending, with those who live in death given a place in the New Order. In this ending, Godwyn would become the most important demigod in the Lands Between, and this has always been my favourite ending, and the one that I chose in my first playthrough. However, while the Prince of Death will be elevated to a position of prominence in the Age of the Duskborn, he will be a passive figure, a powerful totem, but not a god that will take direct actions. Perhaps Godwyn's followers envisage the Prince of Death taking a more active role in this new age by restoring his soul and mind. It does make me wonder if there was going to be more here at some point in development. A lot of groundwork seems to have been laid with his surrounding lore, as if Godwyn was going to have a chance of restoration via the Gate of Divinity. Maybe Mikla was going to take Godwyn as his consort, and his Death Knights here were part of that story. Or perhaps they were here separate from Mikla, but there would have been more in regards to them restoring their lord. One final thought I want to end this video on is the presence of the vulgar militia in the Lands of Shadow. As I have noted in prior videos, these beings are very useful from a lore perspective, as their presence usually marks a location that is forbidden by the Golden Order. We know this because of the tools that they use, the red flames of destined death and the bestial claw incantation. This shows that they are the underlings of Malekith. This is also why they guard the bestial sanctum. They are his tools, and he wields them to preserve Marika's rule. This is why they guard the forbidden path between Leyndell and the mountaintops of the giants, as well as the hidden path to the Erdtree. These locations both are associated with organizations or forces that have caused problems for Leyndell, so it isn't a huge shock to see a battalion of them in the Lands of Shadow, as there are plenty of things in these lands that the Golden Order would want to remain contained. Additionally, their armor sets very much imply they are themselves hated, so why not use the sealing of the Lands of Shadow to get rid of them as well? I find it to be of huge interest that we find the Shadow Militia guarding the catacombs that contain Godwyn's cadavers. I did earlier point out that the Shadow Militia do not have the Malekith-related abilities, and thus suggest that they were sealed at a time before the Night of the Black Knives. But that does not mean that they still were not employed by Marika's kin at this time. Given they guard the horn-sent remains of the Shadow Keep, I believe they are in these lands doing the bidding of Messmer. Godwyn's resurrection would spell doom for the current order, and so these shadowy minions slink in the bushes around the entrances to the catacombs. They are right to fear him. Aside from Mikla, there are few demigods who inspire as much loyalty as the Golden. As the Prince of Death, he has coiled himself around the lands between, and elements of him have even breached the Lands of Shadow. Even in his coma-like state, Godwyn still casts a long shadow, and his growth is not stopping anytime soon. It would have been interesting to get more of Godwyn. He is like the Artorias of Elden Ring, a character we have heard so much about, but one we do not get to meet in their prime. However, I am pleased that we at least got to meet some of his followers, and some more details regarding his earlier history as Godwyn the Golden. So thank you everyone, that is my take on the new lore surrounding Godwyn and the Lands of Shadow. I do feel that one of the best elements of the DLC was presenting us with the idea of gold and shadow, and how death fits into this system of duality. The lore of death in Elden Ring did seem as though it was missing something, and I do think the Lands of Shadow fills that role as an underworld. If you want more Godwyn, then I would still recommend watching my prior video, as we really get into the meat of Godwyn's base game lore and what it actually means to live in death. But let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Did you also like the way death was presented in the DLC? Do you agree with my take on the Lands of Shadow and how death is drawn here? As always, I also welcome your thoughts on what you'd like me to cover next, but until next time, I will see you in the Lands of Shadow. Take care and have a wonderful evening.